Wuhan is located in the central Chinese province of Hubei. It's home to 11 million people. Also in this sprawling metropolis is one of the world's leading biological research facilities, the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
It was built by the French and included a cooperation agreement, which meant that French scientists would be included in the research groups in Wuhan and that they would work together on this virological research. By the end of 2014, they had effectively excluded all the French that were in the Institute. And, the suspicion on the part of the French was that, that they were pushed out because of the Chinese military interest in the work.
So what could this indicate about the type of research they were intending to undertake at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Jordan, come over here, come over here. This is freaking crazy. You see this house right here?
Yeah, I see it.
Someone is making $50,000.
Well, I mean, the suggestion would be its relevance to biological warfare.
In terms of coronavirus research, what was going on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Well, so what we do know, I mean, is that they were one of the world's leading repository of coronaviruses.
That research was headed up by Shizheng Li. They call her the Batwoman. She's China's top virologist, and her specialty, bat viruses.
So it does look like COVID-19, at some point did originate as a bat virus. That I think most people would accept that as a premise. The question then is more about how did those changes occur that make it unique and that make it so well adapted to humans.
In 2012, Shizheng Li hit pay dirt. At a disused mine in southwestern China, 6 workers fell ill after clearing away bat manure. 3 died from a coronavirus. But Beijing covered it up and told no one.
To a virologist obsessed with SARS-like viruses, that mine was a gold mine, pardon the pun, for new viruses to study. And they've returned to it at least 5 times, the Mojiang mine. That's what Xi Jinping has been doing for 2 decades. She's been going around various bat caves, mostly in Yunnan, China, and collecting bat viruses.
Hundreds of samples were brought back to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There, scientists were slicing, manipulating, and combining genetic sequences from different viruses together.
The story of the mine's intriguing, one, because most of us only first learnt about it, in early 2020, when the Wuhan Institute of Virology said, we've gone to all the viruses, coronaviruses we've got stored in the lab to look to see, did we actually have COVID-19 in our repository? And then they said, we didn't find, COVID-19, but hey presto, we found, the very closest genetic relative to this, which is RATG13. Here it is.
RATG13 is the name of one coronavirus they extracted from the bats in those caves. It is 96.2% identical to the virus that causes COVID-19.
Then the natural question is, Did they find COVID-19 on one of those trips? And if so, why haven't they told us about it? Or did they manipulate, rat G13 or one of the other coronaviruses that they found in this cave, and that created COVID-19? And of course, that always raises the question, well, how far did they push the boundaries? What research were they doing?
By early 2020, this administration has developed a very healthy and justifiable suspicion of a lot of things China saying is doing and China promised to do.
Miles Yu was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's principal China advisor. As 2020 rolled in, Miles started paying close attention to Wuhan.
For weeks and weeks, the Chinese government kept silent on the outbreak. They're not saying anything, as if nothing is happening. So citizen journalists are beginning to send out their videos and reports and hospital situation reports on a daily basis.
就凳子上躺着。
我们今年的疫情堪比03年的非典。 而2次疫情的爆炸都是因为对于事实的隐瞒，对于信息的封锁，我们不能一错再错了。
One of those citizen journalists is Chen Qiushi. He's also a lawyer. Chen had heard China was covering up the unfolding tragedy in Wuhan. So he went there and started posting videos.
那个护士还主动问我：“你看没看网上那3具尸体停走廊里的视频？” 我说看了，对，那个官方已经辟谣了，但是是真的。我说啥？官方已经辟谣了，但是真的。
And then he disappeared. Mr. President, what evidence were you presented with that convinced you that it did, in all likelihood, come from a lab?
Well, I started hearing stories that you have also, that there were lots of body bags outside of the lab. And people were saying there are a lot of people lying down on the streets of Wuhan, and there were body bags.
Body bags outside of the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I heard that a long time ago. And if they did, in fact, have body bags, that was one little indication, wasn't it?
Was that something that came from the agencies, the intelligence agencies? Is that what they were telling you?
I don't know where it came from. Ask China. But you're going to have to figure that out, and you probably will be able to do it, knowing you.
President Trump told me that there were body bags outside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Is this correct?
I don't want to talk about particular things. Presidents get the chance to talk about things that some of the rest of us can't. But there was an enormous, albeit indirect, evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the center point for this. Remember, too, there were 14 American diplomats on the ground in Wuhan at this time who were watching and observing what was taking place inside of Wuhan. I hope one day that we'll be able to get that information out more broadly, but as I come back to it, the cumulative evidence that one could see points singularly to the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
If there was really no blame here, if this was really just some naturally occurring virus because someone ate a bat from a wet market, China wouldn't have done the things that they did. The Chinese Communist Party would not have shut down Wuhan. They would not have silenced doctors and scientists and journalists and disappeared some of them.
John Ratcliffe was the United States Director of National Intelligence, the overlord of 18 different agencies. When did the intelligence community first become aware that there was a virus spreading in Wuhan?
You know, in late 2019, we have intelligence from both, human intelligence sources and signals intelligence sources and other intelligence sources that were telling us that there was some sort of a problem in Wuhan.
Key to that assessment was intelligence that 3 people working in the Wuhan Institute of Virology had become sick in October 2019. This was well before the first official case was eventually announced in late December.
What Mike Pompeo and I put out is, you know, people became sick at the lab in October and with symptoms that became entirely consistent with what most people have experienced around the world from COVID-19.
Do you believe that to be the first cluster of the pandemic?
Based on everything I've seen, this is the first cluster.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Former CIA Director Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State during the pandemic. His knowledge of COVID-19 was second to none in the Trump administration.
I have seen no evidence that there's a cluster that began any place but this. I am all ears to see of any evidence that presents some fact set to the contrary.
Are you a business owner looking for an affordable new way to optimize your communications and boost sales? Hi.
David Asher also agrees that this could have been the first cluster of the pandemic.
My shock was that we had actually could have had foreknowledge. We could have known in November of 2019 that there was a disaster occurring inside Wuhan, inside their most important biological facilities, you know, where something absolutely tragic, traumatic, and dramatic was occurring, and we could have reacted to it. I said we could have, you know, the whole world could have been different. It would have been like stopping 9/11 before it happened.
Which raises the question, if US intelligence knew there was a virus in Wuhan in late 2019, why didn't they do anything about it? Was this an intelligence failure?
We collect everything and know nothing in our governments these days. It's the big data problem. We're all drowning in it. We had the means to know something, but we didn't either analyze it or disseminate it or even know that it was collected.
I always worry about that. As the former director of the CIA, I was always worried that we were collecting information, but we weren't able to process it sufficiently timely and get that information to the right places.
Is this a pandemic that potentially could have been prevented had the intelligence agencies paid closer attention to the information that was coming in?
We'll have to go look back at what was actually in the possession, what was the complexity of the information, what was the certainty of that information.
Should there be a review?
Sure, I think we always should go back and look at how we collected and what we knew and why it was we weren't able, that didn't send the signal up the line in a way that was, would have led to a better outcome.
Did they survive, those 3 workers who got sick?
What I can say is that from the intelligence perspective is we know that some of the people that were most involved, either infected or reporting on or whistleblowing on or trying to get answers and journalists report on, have been difficult to track down later, at least from my time there. And so, you know, I think that's consistent with what the Chinese Communist Party does. Why, you know, the status of those individuals and why they've disappeared, I really can't comment on that.
One of those people who was reported to have disappeared was Huan Yanglin. Is she one of the ones that we believe fell sick with COVID-19?
I don't know her status, but you know, the information that you're talking about that's out in the public domain is consistent with what I've seen and what I'm familiar with.
Huan Yanglin was a researcher at the Institute. In early 2020, she disappeared from its website. Her social media presence also vanished. Despite Beijing's denials, many believe Huang was infected with COVID-19. She's never been seen since.
You know, in the West, you might say, oh, this person just want to protect her privacy. In China, privacy, in the interest of the state, doesn't exist. So it would have been such a big, triumphant media scoop for the Chinese government to showcase her, to give like 10 seconds of her appearing somewhere, making a speech, show up in the news media, and that would have basically score a major victory for the Chinese propaganda machine. She never did. She is literally disappeared from public view. Making people disappear is actually a major feature of the regime. I mean, it's actually truly a People's Republic of disappearances. Dissidents, journalists, and anybody the government doesn't like, they disappear. They disappear into oblivion forever. This is basically a regime that is not only capable of doing these things, and then do this with great pride.
And it's not only people that go missing. On the 12th of September 2019, the virus database at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was taken offline. 22,000 coronavirus samples gone. And that very same day, the Institute beefed up its security and issued a tender to replace its air conditioning system. This, in September, is when the evidence suggests a leak first occurred. What does that indicate to you about the origins of the virus and whether an outbreak might have occurred or become known to the Wuhan Institute of Virology at that early date?
So I've seen data points that place it in the summertime of 2019, late summer, July, August of 2019. These are all parts of the pieces, right? This is all the cumulative weight of the evidence that suggests that it did come from this lab.
And a month later, the Institute went into a communications blackout. There was no cell phone or signals activity on the compound for about 2 weeks. How significant would a blackout period at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, as has been reported, how significant would that be?
Again, it would be another circumstance that would be difficult to explain other than there was a problem that the Chinese Communist Party was aware of and was trying to deal with before it became an outbreak that was public and then ultimately a pandemic that affected every single person on the planet.
Everyone around the world assumed it had come from an animal, but we didn't know what animal.
In the early days of the pandemic, Australian scientist Nikolai Petrovsky made an extraordinary discovery.
I guess the first surprising result that we found that really stumped us for a while was there was no animal, and that opened, obviously, Pandora's box, because then we had to start saying, well, if it didn't come from an animal, where did it come from? And of course, that led into, I guess, exploration of other possibilities. And one of those, of course, was that could this have potentially have come, from a laboratory?
在过去的30多年里，新发和突发传染病在全球范围内呈现出扩散趋势，特别是自2003年以来相继爆发的 SARS 高致病性禽流感、埃博。
That's me, Meredith Erickson, food writer and cookbook author, and that is Canada.
埃博拉等。
This video was part of the official launch of the Wuhan Institute of Virology's latest lab, BSL-4. It clearly shows there were bats in the lab. And that's a fact World Health Organization investigators said was a conspiracy. It was passed on to me by a group of scientists and researchers who've been digging into the origins of COVID-19. They call themselves Drastic.
When the outbreak happened, a lot of people noticed that it's quite a coincidence that it happened in the same city where there's this premier lab studying coronaviruses. And, people were saying, well, that's suspicious. And everybody who said there could be more to it, they were called conspiracy theorists.
Yuri Dagan is a genetic engineer. From Moscow, he watched COVID-19 spreading around the world. In April 2020, Yuri wrote an essay arguing that the animal-to-human theory just didn't stack up. Can you detail some of the issues that you uncovered in that Medium paper that were just so crucial?
Basically, it's that the Wuhan Institute of Virology that is located at the epicenter of the outbreak has been creating chimeric genetically modified coronaviruses for many, many years. And they've been putting these spike proteins from different viruses in their backbones and then studying like how well does that infect human cells. Just this alone formed a very plausible argument that this is actually the lab that hosts so many different coronaviruses, explains the lab leak the best.
Yuri, this was highly risky coronavirus research that was happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and no one seemed to be paying any attention to it.
Yes, this kind of work of very dangerous, potentially pandemic pathogens, being made more transmissible and potentially more lethal to humans, nobody paid attention to it because nobody cared about this kind of work in virology until the outbreak happened.
To begin with, I certainly didn't approach the issue with any sort of suspicion or foregone conclusions. However, things began to change as the pandemic evolved.
Sir Richard Dearlove also ran into resistance to the lab leak theory. He's the former head of the British spy agency, MI6. Early in the pandemic, two scientists asked for his help in publishing a paper that cast doubt on COVID-19 coming from an infected animal.
We approached Nature, we approached Science, we approached the American Journal of Virology, we approached various publications in the UK, and it was clear to me that there was a sort of united front not to put anything in the public domain which questioned the Chinese narrative.
How disturbing is this censorship? And do you think it amounted to Chinese disinformation?
I'm pretty sure that the Chinese, after the outbreak in Wuhan, and they're very good at doing this, sat down and, developed their own information campaign.
So, Richard, you were one of the first people internationally to come out and say this virus may be the result of a laboratory leak. How were you treated after you made those remarks?
I had people saying to me, Richard, my strong advice is you don't get involved in this issue. It's conspiracy theory. And I mean, my reply to them was, if that's what you really think, you haven't really looked at the science. You don't understand the arguments. And I suggest you go back and delve into this a bit more deeply, because you're going to find some pretty strange things when you do. Boy, did I get put-downs from, some very important parts of government who basically were keen that I shut up.
Was this by British government or British intelligence?
I'll leave it to your imagination, given my past links.
Another paper that struggled to find a home was from Professor Petrovsky. His research found the virus was better adapted to infect humans than any other animal, including bats.
And we thought the scientific journals,